Hola, somos Claudia Juárez
y Maricruz Cuevas,
y en este podcast queremos hablarte de microbiota, nutrición, tóxicos, salud mental y más.
Queremos compartirte lo que sabemos y pensamos acerca de la salud, así como nuestras experiencias tanto personales como con nuestros pacientes y clientes.
Escúchanos cada semana con un tema diferente.
Hablemos de salud.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenido y bienvenida a este podcast Hablemos de Salud con Claudia y Maricruz. En esta ocasión tenemos un invitado muy especial, el Dr. Paul Clayton, quien es farmacólogo y farmaconutricionista, y con él hablamos acerca de la nutrición, el omega 3 y algunos otros temas que considero de suma importancia y que creo serán del interés de la mayoría. Aquí la entrevista. Hello everyone. Welcome to our podcast Hablemos de Salud con Claudia y Maricruz. Maricruz is not today with me because she's traveling, but Dr. Ayumi is. Hi Ayumi, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Claudia.
Thank you for joining me. And today also we have a very special guest, Dr. Paul Clayton. Dr. Clayton is a clinical pharmacologist and pharmaconutritionist. He is a PhD in neuropharmacology from the University of Edinburgh, and he is a former chair of the Forum on Food and Health in UK and senior scientific advisor to the UK government's Committee on the Safety of Medicines. Welcome.
It's good to be here, wherever here is.
Thank you. Let's do some, we have prepared some questions. In our meeting in Zaragoza, you talk about the importance of nutrition for health and all the problems we have as society because malnutrition. But I would like to ask you specifically, why omega-3? What is the importance of fatty acids for health, especially for men's health?
Well, that's a very complicated question because there are many fatty acids. People know a little bit about the omega-3s and they know about saturated and unsaturated and monounsaturated. We work a lot with the omega-3s, EPA and DHA, but there's another omega-3 called DPA, and there's many other fatty acids, generally the ones which have an odd number of carbons, so C5, C7, C9, and some longer chain fatty acids, which have different complementary effects. You can regard them all as being somewhat anti-inflammatory. Now, the business aspect of this, it's mostly focused on fish oil. And I have to say that despite some interesting work in the early days, the therapeutic activity of fish oil has been tested and tested and tested again. And it has been found to be minimal or absolutely zero. In fact, there's now a consensus beginning to emerge that by taking too much fish oil, you may well increase the risk of an atrial fibrillation. So fish oil is really being reconsidered. It's being repositioned. And we're having to think very hard about what its value actually is in supporting metabolic health and male health. And we can come back to that in a minute. If I can talk for just a little longer, what is emerging now is that the fish oil industry made a huge mistake when they started refining it. Now, when you find fish oil in the wild, in the fish, that is, or in the marine algae, that is where the fish, the cold water fish, get their omega-3s from. And these are cold water algae, which are plants, they're like plants at the bottom of the marine food chain. The omega-3s are always co-present with some very interesting compounds, which are chaperones. Now, they're amphiphilic polyphenols. Then in the marine food chain, they're called fluorotannins. And they bind so closely together that you never find the omega-3s on their own. And that's how these very fragile molecules can travel from the algae to the krill to the pelagic fish to the large fish over a period of many, many months and still arrive intact in the body of the apex predator, who, let's say, is an Inuit in the original investigation, and now could be anyone today who eats oily fish. So the industry decided, for reasons unknown, that omega-3s were all that mattered, and all you had to do is to clean them up and make them taste nice and make them look nice and golden, and that's what they sell. And now we know it doesn't work, and it works only if you add the polyphenols back in.
Okay.
It's that acts as a chaperone and protects the omega-3s until, after you've eaten them, they can be deposited in your cell membranes. Now, if you eat fish oil, commercial fish oil, it's unprotected. Vitamin E doesn't work, astaxanthin doesn't work. And so a lot of it is broken down, and it forms rather nasty compounds, malondialdehyde, a range of nonenal compounds. And guess what? These are cytotoxic and they're arrhythmogenic. So if you eat a lot of fish oil, you're making a lot of these really unpleasant breakdown compounds, and that is what is causing the increased risk of atrial fibrillation. And that's probably why when you take commercial fish oil, it has no benefit. So all we've done is to reconstitute nature. We have put these very special polyphenols back into the fish oil. They have to be amphiphilic, by the way. And we've reconstituted oily fish in liquid form. So that's what balanced oil is. And when we look at tissue levels of the omega-3s in people who take fish oil, you end up with a ratio of 6 to 3 fatty acids of about 10 to 1, which is okay, but it's not enough to have an effect. If you eat oily fish, you'll reach a ratio of 2 or 3 to 1, which is anti-inflammatory. If you take balanced oil, which is a liquid version of oily fish, you do the same thing. Your ratio of 6s to 3s comes down and down and down, and as it drops below 5, then goes down to 4 or 3. What we see in clinical terms is that inflammatory symptoms start to disappear, whether they're cardiovascular, essential hypertension, whether they're dermatological, whether they are affecting the joints, or whether they're manifesting as neuroinflammatory stress and behavioral problems. So we have a very convergent and neat set of data. As the ratios come down, the symptoms fade away. And in fact, what we find is that the majority of patients who go down this road eventually become symptom-free, and they become pharmaceutically independent. They no longer need their medication. A huge claim to make, but we've seen this occur in tens of thousands of patients now.
Now, for instance, I have 10/1, which is 3 more times the WHO recommendation, and some patients have 30 or more, which is, I think, very dramatic. And Dr. Ayumi, you have more questions for Dr. Clayton?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Clayton, to be with us and save your valuable time for this interview. Well, some omega-3 supplements can be harmful because heavy metals. How to avoid this in the production of a good quality of supplement?
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, heavy metals our exposure to them is increasing due to industrial activity. We see more and more of this as a problem. And in some parts of the world, it's very much part of the environment. For example, arsenic in parts of India and Bengal and Bangladesh. If you're making a supplement, and we see it in rice, for example, these heavy metals are quite widely disseminated. So we have to be very careful when we're making supplements, and that absolutely is important if you're trying to make fish oil, because there are various mercury compounds in the ocean which can actually be bioaccumulated. And so we have to take very great care to remove, if we see anything like this, we will remove it very carefully before the oil can be released for production purposes. We minimize it also by harvesting only pelagic fish in the southern hemisphere, off the coast of South America, where pollution is rather less. Is it completely pollution-free? No, I don't think anybody can say that. And could I also say that they're organic pollutants as well that we need to be careful of. There are some rather nasty compounds that are used in industrial cooling systems, which have moved into the sea. They're in the water table, and they're in the marine food system network. So we have to be careful of those. And there are a number of pesticides, which also can bioaccumulate. So all of this has to be screened for. And it has to be done, it has to be sampled by an independent third-party laboratory. And it's only when we see that we have a material that meets all the safety criteria that we would want to start getting into manufacture and processing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are talking with Dr. Paul Clayton about omega-3, and stay with us. We will be back in a minute. We are in Hablemos de Salud con Claudia y Maricruz. ¿Te gustaría mejorar tu salud? ¿Estás cansado o cansada de estar enfermo? La inflamación es uno de los factores, particularmente cuando es crónica, que más afecta tu salud. Acércate a nosotras para conocer cuáles son los suplementos, y no solamente suplementos, los protocolos de salud que hemos diseñado para ayudarte a recuperar tu salud. Debajo de este podcast o video encontrarás nuestra información de contacto, a través de la cual puedes tener acceso tanto a Maricruz como a mí. We are back, and we are talking with Dr. Paul Clayton about nutrition. And I would like to ask you, Paul, what other nutrients besides omega-3 are important for men's health?
Well, if we're talking about specifically about men's health, so we're talking about spermatogenesis, sexual function, and the prostate, then there are actually quite a wide number of nutrients that have some sort of role to play here. Let's talk about spermatogenesis first, because this is a very hot issue at the moment. There's a lot of evidence that sperm counts have been declining in the OECD nations by almost 2/3, in fact, over the last 3 decades. Very alarming. And we've seen this fall being repeated both in intranational and international studies. So it's pretty much a consensus now that this is a problem. And what that means that we're seeing more men presenting who are subfertile or clinically infertile. Now, what's going on here? Well, various people have come up with different theories. Some people say it's tight, underpants that are too tight. That's ridiculous. Various people have said that there might be microplastics, and microplastics are probably feeding into this. But I think that one of the major problems is chronic inflammatory stress. Now, we have 1.5 million tissue samples now, blood samples now. And we know that because of the way in which the food industry has charged ahead towards ultra-processed foods, that people are eating enormous volumes of omega-6 fatty acids in plant oils. And the average 6:3 ratio in Europe is now about 15:1. North America, about 25:1. And we've seen ratios of up to 200:1. And these people seriously have chronic inflammatory stress, very seriously. Now, the gonads are what is known as an immunologically privileged organ. And they have to be, because you're producing sex cells which don't quite have the same genetic makeup as you do. And so if they were left unprotected, your immune system would probably start to attack them. So the site where the sperm are produced has to be protected. And what you have in this site is a physiological low level of inflammatory stress, ideally. If you are starting to eat more ultra-processed foods, as we all are, the 6:3 ratio is creeping up. We're having more inflammatory stress. At that certain point, both spermatogenesis and also steroidogenesis in the testes start to decline. So now you're making less sperm. The sperm you are making are probably more dysfunctional, and your testosterone levels are falling. So this is going to have an impact on your fertility and your potency. I'm not saying these are the only nutrients that are important, but they're very, very important. They are critical. So I would say that if for someone who is having these types of problems or knows they have this problem, then a properly formulated fish oil, that is with the polyphenols, is going to help them to reduce the inflammatory stress and may be enough on itself to restore physiological normality in the testes, and by the way, also in the prostate. Now, the process whereby the sperm are made and whereby everything else in and around the testes function, it needs a lot of other cofactors. So you need copper, you need zinc, you need selenium, you need vitamin E, you need vitamin C. The list goes on and on and on. And we know now that a lot of people have what is known as type B malnutrition. So to the properly produced fish oil, the fish oil with the polyphenols, as I said, I would add a very, very broad spectrum micro and phytonutrient support program. I think there's not a huge amount of evidence for this, but my gut feeling tells me that it would be a good idea to add 1,3,1,4 beta-glucans into the mix as well, because these are what is known as PAMPs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns, and they have a very interesting and positive effect on the innate immune system, which is part and parcel of the way in which the sperm and in fact testosterone are made in the testes. So you should have that as part of your support program as well. There's more. We know now that dysbiosis has a knock-on effect on prostate pathology and function. This is relatively recent, but if you have a large intestine full of proteolytic bacteria, which many of us have because of the dietary shift issue, you will then have endotoxemia. You have a leaky gut, in other words, and you may also have the the movement of enteric bacterial species into the bloodstream, and they can go elsewhere and cause all kinds of problems. So I would add to that the regime of the fish oil and the multi, micro, and phytonutrient. I would add to that an appropriately tailored combination of prebiotic fibers, which will then move the balance of the bacteria and the microorganisms in the large intestine away from proteolytic towards saccharolytic. Now, a lot of jargon here, but basically what that means is you now have a gut that's full of species that we would call probiotic, and they're breaking those prebiotic fibers down to produce compounds which are really helpful to us, which reduce inflammatory stress. And now we know are positive in terms of prostate function and development. So it's a tripartite program. It's one that we find useful for the management of many other chronic health conditions, and we certainly find it helpful here. A lot of men who have had fertility or potency problems actually find function is pretty much restored after they've been on a program like this for 3 to 4 months. And we see many, many men who had previous problems with infertility actually become fathers, which is always very happy to see.
Wow, incredible. I think about other clinical signs of this chronic inflammatory stress, such as alopecia, and is very common, and depression. As I understand, depression is neuroinflammation, is related to neuroinflammation, and this is because, as you said, omega-3 deficiency and type B malnutrition. For instance, I tested positive for nutritional deficiencies as well as my patients. So it's very common, right?
It has become very common, I mean, almost universal, because if you're eating ultra-processed foods, which tend to be calorie dense, but nutrient light, well, you're eating so many empty calories that your intake of many of the micro and phytonutrients is low anyway. And then the other issue that we have is we no longer work in the fields or work in the forages or the factories very much. we mostly work in offices, and we simply aren't requiring as many calories as we used to 2 or 3 generations ago. So I think that you probably drove to the office. You didn't ride in on horseback or cycle there. So we're actually eating less food, less calories than we did 2 or 3 generations ago. And many of the calories we do eat are empty, thanks to the machinations of the food industry. I mean, a can of Coca-Cola, for example, is all calories all the time with no nutritional value whatsoever. And there's many ultra-processed foods which you can sort of fit into that same bracket. So we do see that many people, and the majority, in fact, are low in a whole array of vitamins, trace elements, specific fiber, dietary fibers, fatty acids, phytonutrients, conditionally essential amino acids, conditionally essential amino sugars, methyl group donors. The list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, that's right. Ayumi?
Thank you. Dr. Paul, are there any specific recommendations you can give to our audience, for instance, when to take and how to take omega-3?
The one thing you should remember is that you shouldn't take omega-3s too soon before or too soon after taking intense physical exercise. Because if you do, you take the omega-3s, they're in the bloodstream, and now you're running around or lifting weights or playing football, and you're going to start utilizing those fatty acids for fuel, rather than using them for their much more valuable purpose, which is incorporating them into the cell membranes, where they're going to exert their anti-inflammatory effect. So that's really the important thing.
Oh, very interesting. And what happens if we take it at before bed?
No problem. I mean, in fact, that's a good time to take it. But if you're taking a lot of exercise in the morning, take the omega-3s in the afternoon or the evening. If you're going to go to the gym last thing at night, then take the omega-3s in the morning. That's the really important thing.
Okay. Thank you very much.
This is a very interesting conversation. I would like to thank Dr. Paul Clayton for this interview. And I would like to invite you maybe in another occasion.
I'd be delighted to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will be back in Hablemos de Salud con Claudia y Maricruz. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Welcome. You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Y bueno, espero que esta entrevista haya sido de tu interés y de tu agrado. El protocolo de salud al cual hace referencia el Dr. Paul Clayton, como comentó, comprende tanto lo que es el Balance Oil, que es el omega 3, un omega 3 de muy alta calidad, como la fibra prebiótica, importante para la microbiota intestinal, y el multivitamínico. Estos 3 elementos conforman lo que es el protocolo de salud desarrollado por Signos, el cual puede ser empleado por personas de cualquier edad. Te invito a que te acerques a nosotras para conocer más acerca de este protocolo y empezar a ver cambios en tu salud. Recuerda, lo que no hagas por ti, nadie más lo hará. Y hoy es el día perfecto para comenzar. Nos vemos o nos escuchamos la próxima ocasión. Si te interesó este programa y quieres saber más acerca de cómo podemos ayudarte, ponte en contacto con nosotras.